Hey, what's up? Jeff Ratcliffe here. The Arizona Cardinals are one of the most intriguing teams entering 2019, especially for fantasy football purposes, but there are a lot of questions surrounding that team. So what is the outlook for 2019 fantasy football with the Arizona Cardinals? I think you have to start with the fact that there is a new head coach in place. Kliff Kingsbury brings an exciting brand of offense to this team, which was not very exciting on the offensive side of the ball last year. But, when you think about Kingsbury, he could be an absolute slam dunk. He also could be Chip Kelly 2.0. I mean, all of those are within the range of expectations in terms of outcomes. So we can't necessarily just say, oh, this is going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread in the Arizona offense. It could be, though. It could be. So we don't really know exactly how Kingsbury is going to translate to the NFL. But what we do know is his offense was extremely high-paced, up-tempo, spread at the college level, and that sort of offense is certainly conducive to putting up major numbers, which is good for fantasy purposes. So hopefully that will be the outcome for us for fantasy this year. Of course, we know he has a quarterback who could potentially run that offense in the first overall pick, Kyler Murray. Such a fascinating player for a number of reasons. An unconventional quarterback from a height standpoint. We know he's not 6'5". He isn't even 6 foot. But what he is extremely dynamic as a runner. One of the most dynamic running quarterbacks that we've seen enter the league in recent memory. But unlike a lot of running quarterbacks, he can sling it. He won the Heisman Trophy last year. Kyler won that for a reason. And honestly, that offense didn't look that much different with Kyler under center than it did with Baker Mayfield. He isn't quite the passer that Baker Mayfield is, but he's not that far away either, and he's a much better running quarterback. So this is really intriguing. Now, Kyler Murray, for fantasy purposes, a wide range of expected outcomes as well. He could be an absolute force in fantasy. He could also be a bit of a dud. I mean, let's face it, the offensive line isn't going to do him many favors. Although he is the type of player who maybe he doesn't need the offensive line. He can throw on the move. He has that athletic ability to do so. He's a very similar skill set in a lot of ways to Russell Wilson. So I don't know if that's the biggest knock necessarily. You're going to see Kyler Murray go all over the place in your fantasy drafts. I think the best place to view him is a fringe quarterback one. So maybe in a 12-team league, the 12th, 13th, 14th quarterback off the board. That way, if you get him in that range and you hit a home run, you really knock it out the park, you could have a front-end quarterback one on your hands. But if he misses a little bit this year, it isn't that devastating to spend an early pick on him. So really like Kyler Murray, though, for the long-term. Skill set, so intriguing. Of course, David Johnson on this roster. Johnson should benefit from Murray and the stability of this offense this year. It should look very different than it did last year. And last year for Johnson, let's face it, he was a disappointment, wasn't he? If you drafted him 3rd overall, which is very likely where he went in your leagues, maybe even 2nd overall, he finished as the number 10 fantasy running back in PPR, which isn't terrible. A lot of people were saying he was a fantasy bust. I don't know if I'd go that far. He was a disappointment, not a bust. He was 11th among running backs in points per game as well. So, he was still an RB1 in that range, just not what people expected him to be. But can you blame him on that offense? That offense was downright terrible. They had the 1st overall pick for a reason. Fast forward 6 months later, and now a lot of people want to get their hands on David Johnson in the mid-first round as their RB1. I think, he certainly warrants consideration there with what he can do out of the backfield as a receiver, with what he can do in early downs, with the fact that there's really no competition for touches there in an offense that could run a lot of plays. There's a lot to like about David Johnson. Of course, keep in mind, this is his age 27 season. So you dynasty folks, you might want to look to move off David Johnson, trade him before he gets too old. You always want to trade them before they get too old in dynasty. Of course, at wide receiver, speaking of a little old, Larry Fitzgerald coming to the end of the line of certainly a Hall of Fame career. He's been phenomenal, but his days as a fantasy option, I think they are in the rearview mirror. There's just not a high enough ceiling with Larry Fitzgerald to really warrant consideration this year. You're going to want to look elsewhere, and I really think that player is Christian Kirk. He's poised to break out. He should benefit from this system, and you're not going to have to pay a premium price on draft day for him, so you're certainly looking Christian Kirk's way. Of course, this team did draft 2 wide receivers of merit early on in this year's draft. Hakim Butler and Andy Isabella. Very different players, right? Andy Isabella, a slot receiver who's blazing fast, but can be productive out of the slot. He has field stretching ability out of the slot, so a unique player there, no doubt about it. And then Hakim Butler, more of your prototype X receiver, big body player who can play above the rim. Now, when you look at year one, of these two, who's more likely to make an impact? I do think it's Butler, because ultimately Andy Isabella, he plays the same position as Larry Fitzgerald. So I think that's your long-term slot receiver there. We'll see Isabella certainly this year, but to make the bigger fantasy impact, I do think it's Butler. That being said, I don't think either one of them is going to surface on redraft radars this year that frequently. They're more dynasty options, but I do like both of them for dynasty. And by the way, tight end, well, Ricky Seals-Jones is there, but so is Charles Clay. I think they're really going to cannibalize off of each other for fantasy purposes. I don't think there's much value to be had at tight end in Arizona. So there's your 2019 fantasy football preview for the Arizona Cardinals. If you want to see where all these players fall in our rankings, go check those out at ProFootballFocus.com.